All right, so this is part one of a lecture video for Thursday, March 20th. So hopefully by now you've had a chance to glance at what you're doing today and you've had a chance to work on your 20s note to a friend and now this part. So I'll have something tomorrow as well, each day a little bit of a lecture for you to keep us on the schedule along with your activities. Doing it in different parts so we don't exceed 15 minutes in any video because then it's really hard to get them to upload. So this is part one, then there'll be a part two. Topic here is the 1928 presidential election. And by now you should have gotten a packet from the substitute, the Politics of the Great Depression packet. And for this lesson, we're primarily going to focus on the beginning of that, the first Roman numeral. So if you could pull those out and take a look. And we'll make our way through Roman numeral 1 and 2 pretty much with this lesson. I also connected or linked some slides here that you'll follow along with me on the 1928 election, so please listen carefully, take notes, and here we go. So, come 1928, President Coolidge had been in the White House for over 5 years. Remember, he served a year and a half approximately of Harding's term. Then he runs and wins his own term in 1924. This is an interesting one because we know that the only president who ever took over for a president who died who was elected to his own term was Theodore Roosevelt. Now we know it was a big deal about Roosevelt. Do you count that first term or that term you served of McKinley as your first term? Or was that McKinley's term? Well, Roosevelt said, I count that as my first term. So that kind of locked him in if he wanted to honor George Washington's long-standing precedent and tradition that he would only run for one more term of his own. And that's all he did. He got 7.5 years in the White House. Coolidge's situation was a little bit different, though, because Coolidge had only been president for a year and a half. Even in today's day and age, with the 22nd Amendment, he would be eligible to run for 2 terms of his own because he served less than 2 years. Now, that didn't exist then. Coolidge had a much better case to make that year and a half was really Harding's term. So if he wanted to run again in 1928, he most certainly could have. He was in his older 50s, older than 55, about 56 or so, I believe, 57 at this time in 1928. So you would think he was at an age, certainly if he wanted to, he could have run again. But Coolidge decides that's enough. 5.5 years was going to be enough time for him being president. He didn't really have a great desire to run again. We're at the height of 20s prosperity. President Coolidge is extremely popular. He may be Silent Cal, he may be a little dull, he may not be hip to the Roaring 20s culture as we've talked about, but the Roaring 20s is happening. It's the greatest economic time this nation's ever seen at this point. Coolidge is popular. This is a time of great conservatism, as we've talked about. Steer the ship, don't mess with a good thing, let the good times roll. So there really was no movement for change in 1928. The Republicans had dominated politics in that decade, and they likely would continue after this next election cycle. That said, if you go to slide 3, there are divisions in the country, and we've noted these, but it's always good to recall them, and they'll play in some ways in this election. So, of course, we still have regional differences. Maybe they're not as pronounced as they once were, but they're still very much there, north, south, east, west. Probably the bigger division that we have is the urban-rural divide. And we spent pretty extensive time in class addressing that in the last few days, as evidenced by things like the Scopes trial. We also have modern versus traditional. Talked about that. New arguments forming. Those who favor the continuation of prohibition versus those who call for its repeal. And that's often divided on an urban-rural basis as well, where much more support in the cities to repeal prohibition. Whereas in the country, in rural America, there is a greater support still for prohibition. Now, to repeal that, you would need a new constitutional amendment. So that's going to take some time and some work if that's ever going to happen. We know, though immigration has largely ended, there's still a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment in the country. There's racial issues. There's the questions of religion versus science, secular versus non-seculars. They're all there. Well, with Calvin Coolidge making the decision to step aside, go on to slide 4, the Republicans are the heavy favorite to win this election. So who's the next man up? Harding was the one who started it out. He dies. Coolidge takes over. Well, seemingly the next person in line, who the Republicans, the conservative Republicans, really see as their guy to take the mantle from President Coolidge, is a man by the name of Herbert Hoover. Hoover had not spent his whole life in government, though to both Presidents Harding and Coolidge, now for the last 8 years, he was in the cabinet. He was not part of the Ohio gang in Harding's cabinet. He's from Iowa and very clean and not corrupt at all. But he served under both presidents as the Secretary of Commerce. Well, Secretary of Commerce, a major liaison to the business world, strong economy. Hoover's going to have been seen to be doing a very good job in the 1920s. He's a very smart man, highly educated, trained as an engineer, Stanford University. As an Iowan, if he becomes president, he'd be the first American president who is from a state west of the Mississippi River. Hoover is one who speaks several languages. His wife does too. His wife's name is Lou Hoover. And even when they're in the White House, they're fluent in Mandarin Chinese. And they often speak to each other in Mandarin Chinese so that other people around them don't understand what they're saying. He's not necessarily a warm, cuddly, charismatic type of figure, but neither was Coolidge, nor was Harding. That really wasn't the thing of this era. What Hoover was, though, was a very steady hand on a ship who would continue conservative politics. He had a great resume. Other than Secretary of Commerce, he was a decorated, very successful businessman, self-made multimillionaire. He headed the Food Administration during World War I. Remember Victory Gardens and meatless and wheatless and porkless days? We talked about Hoover back then. In many ways, he's living the American dream. Hoover's the Republican nominee. His message, slide 5, I will continue the economic policies, the conservatism of my 2 Republican predecessors. Hands off the government, little to no regulation, low taxes, let the good times continue. In fact, in Hoover's messaging during the campaign, he will frequently say, in America, there's a chicken in every pot. Largely meaning that we had defeated poverty in America. The idea that poverty is something that is in the rearview mirror, it's in the past. Nobody's going to go hungry anymore in America. Everybody's going to have jobs if they want them as an income. And that wasn't just Hoover speaking, that was the predominant belief in America during this time. Remember, at a time where the stock market goes up every year, where jobs are plentiful, where people are buying consumer goods off the shelves, we had done it. We had this feeling as Americans. We fought World War I, we saved freedom, and now we're reaping the benefits of the greatest economy ever. There's a chicken in every pot. Hoover represented, in this time of division, the more traditional, rural roots of the American nation. Very much Anglo-Protestant. He represented that simpler time. Though he is many things in life, he grew up on a farm in Iowa. And Hoover embraces what's called rugged individualism. Again, he's far from alone in this. But it's the idea of small government. The idea that, yes, in life there's going to be troubles, but you make your life, you make your existence. Nobody else is going to be as responsible for what you do in life than you. And Hoover saw it as it is the role of the individual in society to make success for him or herself. Certainly not the government's role. He rejected a lot of progressive policies that seemingly were putting the government in a position to solve people's problems. Hoover, as a conservative, flatly rejected that. He said, no, you solve your problems. You make your life story. And that was what most Americans at this time believed. Again, he's far from alone in this. Now, Hoover recognized that in life people do sometimes have periods where they're down on their luck. A job is lost. Something bad happens to you in your health, your family. Well, in those cases, Hoover himself was a deeply caring, compassionate man. And he encouraged the American people to be the same. So when someone, a loved one, a friend, is down on their luck, you help them. The government doesn't help them, you help them. You turn to people who care about you in your life, your family. And when parents get old, you take care of them like they did when you were young. It's not the government's job to do that. When a person loses a job, you friends, neighbors, family, let him stay at your home. Give him a little help till he gets back on his feet. Not the government's job. No, you turn to your family. You turn to friends. You can turn to your faith. Hoover was a very faithful man. And if all else fails, there are charities in this country. And Hoover practiced what he said here. He was a great giver to charity over the course of his life, donating millions of dollars to various charities. So, rugged individualist model, that's who you turn to in times of trouble. It's not about the government creating new things, new stuff for you. Okay, we've reached a little over 12 minutes here, so I think that's a good time for us to transition to video 2, so we don't come close to coming over and we can get these easily uploaded. So you'll stop here and immediately go to the next lecture video in here, lecture video number 2.